The first whispers began in late summer when Margaret was seen walking with Daniel and his children along the river path after church one Sunday. She had simply offered to show them the best fishing spots, knowing that catching fish might help stretch the family's food budget during the expensive process of establishing the ranch. But, to the watchful eyes of Cedar Ridge's residents, this innocent outing suggested something much more significant. "Did you see Margaret Wilson with that Cooper man and all his children?" Mrs. Patterson whispered to a cluster of women gathered near the church steps, walking together like they were already a family. "I wonder what she thinks she's doing." Margaret had not intended the afternoon to appear romantic or inappropriate, but she began to realize that her friendship with Daniel was being interpreted through the lens of the community's expectations about relationships between unmarried men and women. The fact that she had been considered unsuitable for marriage for so long made her current attention to a widowed father seem both puzzling and somehow improper to many observers. The criticism took on a particularly cruel edge because of Margaret's known inability to bear children. Women who had previously pitied her now seemed almost offended by the possibility that she might find happiness with a ready-made family, as if her biological limitations should disqualify her from any form of maternal role. "It's not right," Margaret overheard Mrs. Jenkins tell her sister during their weekly shopping trip. "That man needs a wife who can give him more children, not someone who's already proven she can't fulfill a woman's most basic duty. Those poor children deserve better than a barren stepmother." The word barren hit Margaret like a physical blow, even though she had heard it applied to herself many times before. In the context of her growing affection for Daniel and his children, it carried a particularly painful sting. She began to question whether her friendship with the family was indeed selfish, whether she was allowing her own loneliness to blind her to what might be best for them. Daniel seemed unaware of the community gossip, or perhaps he was simply too overwhelmed by the practical demands of his situation to pay attention to social speculation. His ranch was beginning to show signs of progress, but the work was exhausting, and the constant responsibility of caring for 5 children while managing all the tasks of farming and livestock care was taking a visible toll on his health. Margaret could see the exhaustion in his face when he came to the store for supplies, and she began to worry about his ability to sustain the pace he had set for himself. When he mentioned that 10-year-old Michael had been trying to help with the harvest but was too small for much of the heavy work, she found herself making an offer that surprised even her. "I could help," she said quietly, glancing around the empty store to make sure they would not be overheard. "I know it's not conventional, but I'm strong enough for farm work, and I have experience with business management that might be useful for planning and organizing tasks." Daniel stared at her in surprise, clearly not having expected such an offer from a woman he knew primarily through business transactions. "That's very generous," he said carefully, "but I couldn't ask you to take on that kind of work. It wouldn't be proper, and people would talk." Margaret felt a surge of frustration at the constraints imposed by social propriety, especially when those constraints seemed designed to prevent practical solutions to real problems. "People are already talking," she said with more directness than she usually allowed herself. "And if your family needs help, does it really matter what they say?" This conversation marked the beginning of a deeper honesty between Margaret and Daniel. Over the following weeks, they began to discuss not just practical matters, but also their frustrations with community expectations and their concerns about the future. Margaret learned that Daniel was struggling not only with the physical demands of his situation, but also with profound loneliness and the weight of making every decision about his children's welfare without a partner's support. "Catherine and I used to talk through everything," he told Margaret one evening as they walked together behind the store, where they could speak privately without attracting attention. Decisions about the children, plans for the ranch, even small daily choices. "I never realized how much I depended on having someone to share those responsibilities with." Margaret understood this loneliness from her own experience, though hers had been a chronic condition rather than a sudden loss. "I've often wondered what it would be like to have someone to plan and dream with," she admitted. "Someone who shared the same goals and could help carry the weight of important decisions." These conversations revealed a growing compatibility between them that went beyond mutual sympathy for each other's difficult circumstances. Margaret discovered that Daniel valued her intelligence, and her practical skills in ways that no one else ever had. He sought her advice about business matters related to the ranch, but he also asked her opinions about his children's education and their emotional needs. "You have good insights about people," he told her after she had suggested a way to help his middle daughter, Sarah, overcome her shyness. "You understand things about my children that I miss sometimes, because I'm so focused on the daily tasks of keeping everything running." Margaret found herself increasingly involved in the Cooper family's daily life, though she was careful to visit the ranch only when other community members might also have legitimate reasons to be there. She helped Emma with meal planning and budgeting, taught the younger children basic arithmetic and reading skills, and assisted with household organization that allowed Daniel to focus more effectively on the ranch work. The arrangement worked well for everyone involved, but it also intensified the community's criticism. Margaret's growing relationship with the family was seen as evidence of inappropriate ambition on her part and poor judgment on Daniel's part. The criticism became more vocal and more personal as autumn progressed. "She's taking advantage of that man's desperation," Margaret heard one woman tell another as they passed the store. "He's too tired and overwhelmed to think clearly about what's best for his children. Someone should talk sense into him before he makes a terrible mistake." Pastor Miller eventually felt compelled to address the situation, visiting Daniel at the ranch to express the community's concerns about the arrangement. Margaret was there that afternoon, helping Emma prepare preserves for winter storage, and she could not help but overhear the conversation between the two men. "People are talking, Daniel," the pastor said gently but firmly. "They're concerned about the example being set for the children, and about whether this arrangement is really in anyone's best interest. Miss Wilson is a fine woman, but her limitations make her unsuitable as a mother figure for your children." Margaret felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she forced herself to continue working while listening to Daniel's response. She was not prepared for the quiet anger in his voice when he replied, "With respect, Pastor, the only people who seem concerned about my children's welfare are those who haven't offered any practical help themselves," Daniel said. "Miss Wilson has done more for my family in 3 months than the entire rest of the community has done since we arrived. If people want to judge our arrangement, perhaps they should consider offering alternative solutions instead of just criticism." Pastor Miller was clearly taken aback by Daniel's directness. "I understand that you're grateful for her help," he said, "but you need to think about the future. Your children will need brothers and sisters eventually, and Miss Wilson cannot provide that. You're a young man, Daniel. You could find a suitable wife who could give you more children and provide proper maternal care for the ones you have." Margaret's hands stilled on the preserves she was preparing as she waited for Daniel's response to this argument. She knew that the pastor was expressing the community's genuine belief about what would be best for the Cooper family, and she could not deny that there was logic to his concerns. Daniel was young and could indeed find another wife who could give him additional children. "I appreciate your concern for my family's welfare," Daniel said after a long pause, "but I think I'm in a better position than anyone else to judge what my children need. And right now, what they need is stability, kindness, and someone who cares about them as individuals. Miss Wilson provides all of those things." After Pastor Miller left, Margaret and Daniel found themselves facing a conversation they had been avoiding for weeks. The community's pressure was becoming too intense to ignore, and they both knew that their current arrangement could not continue indefinitely without forcing some kind of decision about their relationship. "I don't want to cause problems for you and your children," Margaret said quietly as they sat together on the porch while the children played nearby. "If my presence here is hurting your reputation in the community, perhaps I should step back." Daniel was quiet for a long time, watching his children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "Margaret," he said finally, "can I ask you something personal?" Margaret nodded, though her heart was beating rapidly as she anticipated his question. "Are you happy?" he asked. "With your life as it is now, I mean. Do you feel fulfilled by your work at the store and your place in the community?" The question surprised Margaret because it was one she rarely allowed herself to consider honestly. "I have a good life," she said carefully. "I'm useful, and I have work that I enjoy, and I care about the people around me." "That's not what I asked," Daniel said gently. "I asked if you're happy." Margaret considered lying, giving him the socially acceptable answer about finding contentment in her circumstances. But something in his voice suggested that he was asking because he genuinely wanted to understand her experience, not because he was testing her acceptance of her situation. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not happy. I'm grateful for what I have, and I try to make the best of my circumstances, but I'm not happy. I've always felt like I was living only part of a life, watching other people experience things that were forbidden to me." Daniel nodded as if her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "I felt the same way before Catherine died," he said. "Not unhappy, exactly, but like something important was missing. And then, after she died, I felt like my chance for that kind of completeness was gone forever." Margaret waited, sensing that he was working towards something important. "But these past few months, watching you with my children and talking with you about everything we're trying to build here, I've started to feel like maybe there could be different kinds of completeness," Daniel continued. "Maybe what my children need isn't necessarily another biological mother, but someone who loves them and understands them and wants to help them grow into good people." Margaret's heart was racing now, but she forced herself to consider his words carefully rather than simply responding to the hope they offered. "The community believes that children need mothers who can give them siblings," she said. "And there's wisdom in that belief. Your children are still young, and they might benefit from having brothers and sisters as they grow up." "They might," Daniel agreed. "But they might also benefit from having a stepmother who brings other kinds of gifts to their family. Someone who could teach them about business and books and thinking for themselves. Someone who has faced challenges and learned how to find strength in unexpected places." Margaret looked at him carefully, trying to determine whether he was truly considering the possibility he seemed to be suggesting, or whether this was simply a theoretical conversation about different approaches to family building. "Are you proposing to me?" she asked directly, deciding that the situation was too important for indirect communication. Daniel smiled, the first completely relaxed smile she had seen from him since he arrived in Cedar Ridge. "I suppose I am," he said. "Though I'm doing it badly, aren't I? I should probably get down on one knee and make a proper speech about my devotion and my hopes for our future together." Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes, though she was not sure whether they were tears of joy or tears of fear about the challenges they would face. "Daniel, if we marry, you need to understand that you'll never have more children. The community will never accept that choice, and they'll blame both of us when they realize the finality of what you've decided." "I've already raised 5 children from babies to their current ages," Daniel said seriously. "I know what that requires, and I know that I'm ready to focus on helping the children I have become the best people they can be, rather than starting over with babies. And as for the community's acceptance, we'll have to decide whether their approval is worth sacrificing our chance for happiness." Margaret realized that Daniel was offering her not just marriage, but a genuine partnership in raising his children and building a life together. He was proposing a relationship based on mutual respect and shared goals rather than simply romantic attachment or social convenience. The possibility was both thrilling and terrifying. "I love your children," she said quietly. "I've come to care for each of them as individuals, and I would be honored to help raise them. But I want to make sure you've thought through all the implications of what you're suggesting." Daniel reached for her hand, holding it gently as he spoke. "Margaret, you've already been helping to raise my children for months, and they're happier and more secure than they've been since their mother died. Emma talks about things you've taught her, and Michael asks your opinion about projects he's working on. Even little Tommy runs to you when he's hurt or excited about something." Margaret knew that what Daniel was saying about the children was true. Over the past months, she had developed genuine relationships with each of them, understanding their individual personalities and needs in ways that felt natural and satisfying. The prospect of formalizing her role in their lives was deeply appealing. "If I marry you," she said slowly, "I want to do it properly. I want us to stand up in front of this community and make our vows honestly, even if some people disapprove of our choice. I don't want to sneak around or apologize for finding happiness in an unconventional situation." Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said. "If we're going to build a life together, we need to do it with integrity and openness. Our children deserve to see us standing proud of the family we're creating together." Margaret took a deep breath and made the decision that would change everything about her future. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." The engagement announcement, when Daniel made it at church the following Sunday, created exactly the kind of controversy they had expected. Some community members were supportive, particularly those who had observed Margaret's positive influence on the Cooper children. But others were openly critical of the match, viewing it as a mistake that would ultimately hurt the children and limit Daniel's future options. Margaret faced particularly harsh judgment from women who had spent years pitying her unmarried state and who now seemed offended that she had found a path to marriage and motherhood that bypassed their expectations about how such things should happen. "She's stolen that man's future," Mrs. Patterson declared loudly enough for Margaret to hear. "Those children will never have the brothers and sisters they deserve, and he'll regret this decision when he's older and realizes what he's given up." But Margaret also discovered unexpected sources of support. Dr. Harrison, who had delivered her devastating diagnosis years earlier, surprised her by offering his congratulations and his observation that the Cooper children seemed healthier and happier than they had been since arriving in Cedar Ridge. "Sometimes the best medicine for a family is love and stability," he told her privately. "Those children have found both of those things with you, and that matters more than conventional definitions of what a family should look like." The wedding took place on a crisp October morning with about half the community in attendance. Margaret wore her mother's blue dress, altered to fit properly, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Emma and Sarah had gathered for her. Daniel's children stood with them during the ceremony, each of them having asked to be included as part of the family being formally created that day. Pastor Miller performed the ceremony with professional dignity, though Margaret could sense his continued reservations about their choice. When he asked if anyone had objections to the union, the silence stretched long enough that Margaret wondered if someone might actually speak up. But the moment passed, and they were pronounced husband and wife with no public protests. The reception was held at the hotel, with food provided by friends and neighbors who supported their marriage. Margaret was touched by the warmth of the congratulations she received from people who had taken the time to understand what she was bringing to the Cooper family rather than focusing on what she could not provide. As the celebration continued around them, Daniel pulled Margaret aside for a private moment. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, gesturing toward his children, who were running around the room with other young guests. Margaret looked at Emma, who was helping to serve cake to the adults, and at Michael, who was teaching a younger child how to fold napkins into interesting shapes, and at Sarah, who was quietly reading in a corner despite the party atmosphere, and at little Mary and Tommy, who were taking advantage of the adults' distraction to sample extra desserts. "I've been ready for this my entire life," she said honestly. "I just never knew this was the shape my readiness would take." 3 years later, Margaret Cooper stood in the same general store where she had spent so many lonely years, but now she was training Emma in bookkeeping and business management while Michael helped his father with inventory. Sarah had become the family's unofficial librarian, organizing their growing collection of books and helping the younger children with their studies. Mary had developed a talent for working with the horses, and Tommy had appointed himself as the official greeter for customers who visited the store. The ranch had prospered under their combined efforts, and the Cooper family had become fully integrated into the Cedar Ridge community. Some initial critics had been won over by the obvious success of the family arrangement, while others had simply accepted that their disapproval had not prevented Margaret and Daniel from building a happy and productive life together. Margaret had never become pregnant, as everyone had known she would not, but she had become something she had never expected to be, a mother to 5 children who valued her guidance, respected her authority, and sought her comfort when they faced challenges. The love she had thought was impossible for her had arrived in a form she had never imagined, but it was complete and satisfying in ways that exceeded her youngest dreams. "Do you ever regret it?" Daniel asked her one evening as they sat together planning Emma's upcoming graduation celebration. Their oldest daughter had been accepted to the Teachers College in Helena and would be leaving home in the fall to pursue her education. Margaret looked around their home, where Michael was helping Tommy with arithmetic homework while Sarah read aloud to Mary, and the sounds of ordinary family life filled the rooms. I regret the years I spent believing that other people's definitions of my worth were more accurate than my own understanding of what I had to offer, she said. But I don't regret anything about the life we've built together. The woman they had once called useless as a wife had become the cornerstone of a family that defied conventional expectations but embodied all the love, support, and guidance that any children could need. Margaret had learned that worth was not determined by biology or social conventions, but by the willingness to love fully and to contribute meaningfully to the lives of others. In choosing her, Daniel had not settled for less than he deserved, but had recognized that families could be built in many different ways, all of them valid when founded on genuine care and commitment. Years later, when people in Cedar Ridge told the story of Margaret and Daniel Cooper, it was not as a tale of compromise or making the best of difficult circumstances, but as an example of how love and family could take unexpected forms and still create the foundation for happiness and success. The woman they had once pitied had become a respected member of the community, and the widowed father they had thought was making a mistake had built one of the most stable and prosperous families in the valley. Margaret never forgot the pain of those early years when she had believed the community's assessment of her limitations, but she had learned that even the most difficult circumstances could become the foundation for unexpected joy. The life she had built was different from the one she had once imagined, but it was full and meaningful in ways that exceeded anything she had dared to hope for during those lonely years in her father's store. Daniel Cooper arrived in Cedar Ridge on a Tuesday morning in late April, driving a loaded wagon with 5 children of various ages perched among his belongings. Margaret first saw him from the store window as he stopped in front of the hotel across the street, and she could immediately see the weariness in his shoulders as he helped the children down from the wagon. The oldest appeared to be a girl of perhaps 12, followed by 2 boys who looked to be around 10 and 8, another girl who seemed about 6, and a small boy who could not have been more than 4 years old. They stood close together beside the wagon, looking around at their new surroundings with the mixture of curiosity and uncertainty that Margaret recognized in all newcomers to the valley. Daniel himself was a man of perhaps 35, tall and lean with the weathered hands and sun-darkened skin of someone who had spent his life working outdoors. Even from a distance, Margaret could see the careful way he positioned himself to keep all 5 children in his line of sight, and the patient manner in which he answered their questions about their new home. That must be the Cooper family, Thomas Wilson observed, joining his daughter at the window. James Morrison said they'd be arriving this week. That's a lot of responsibility for one man to handle. Margaret watched as Daniel organized his children, assigning the older ones specific tasks while keeping the younger ones close beside him. There was an efficiency to his movements that spoke of long practice, but also an underlying tension that suggested the constant vigilance required to care for so many children without assistance. The family disappeared into the hotel, and Margaret returned to her work, but she found herself glancing toward the window throughout the morning. Around midday, Daniel Cooper entered the general store alone, having presumably left his children at the hotel under the supervision of the oldest girl. "Good afternoon," he said politely, removing his worn hat as he approached the counter. "I'm Daniel Cooper. I believe you might be expecting me to establish an account for supplies." Margaret looked up from the inventory list she was reviewing and found herself meeting the eyes of a man who appeared both determined and exhausted. His face showed the strain of recent grief, but his manner was straightforward and businesslike. "Of course, Mr. Cooper," she replied, moving to retrieve the ledger where they recorded new accounts. "I'm Margaret Wilson, and this is my father's store. We heard you'd purchased the Henderson place. That's good land when it's properly worked." "Yes, ma'am," Daniel agreed, glancing around the well-organized store with obvious approval. "I'll need to establish credit for basic supplies while I get the ranch operational. I have references from Colorado if you need them." Margaret began the process of setting up his account, asking the standard questions about his plans for the property and his expected needs for supplies. As they talked, she found herself impressed by his practical approach to the challenges ahead and his realistic assessment of the work required to restore the abandoned ranch. "I'll need seed for spring planting," he explained, "and basic tools to repair the buildings and fences. The house needs work before winter, and I'll need supplies for that as well. I'm hoping to get a small herd of cattle established before fall. That's ambitious for a first year, Margaret observed, making notes in the ledger, especially with 5 children to care for. Do you have help coming, or family planning to join you? Daniel's expression darkened slightly, and Margaret immediately regretted the personal nature of her question. No, ma'am, he said quietly. It's just me and the children now. We'll manage. Margaret felt a pang of sympathy for this man who was clearly struggling with responsibilities that would challenge anyone. She had seen other widowed parents in the community, but none who were attempting to establish a new ranch while caring for so many children. I apologize, she said softly. I didn't mean to pry into personal matters. I just know how challenging ranch work can be, and with children. No offense taken, Daniel replied, his voice gentle but firm. You're right that it will be challenging, but sometimes a man has to do what's necessary for his family, regardless of the difficulties. Margaret completed the paperwork for his account and helped him select immediate supplies for his family's needs. As she wrapped his purchases, she found herself thinking about the practical challenges he would face. 5 children required constant supervision, but ranch work demanded long hours away from the house. The oldest girl was probably capable of helping with the younger ones, but that was a heavy responsibility for a child. Mr. Cooper, she said as he prepared to leave, if you need recommendations for local services, people who might help with various tasks, I know most everyone in the valley. Sometimes newcomers don't realize what resources are available. Daniel paused, studying her face as if trying to determine whether her offer was genuine or merely polite conversation. That's very kind, he said finally. I may take you up on that offer. We're going to need all the help we can get. Over the following weeks, Daniel became a regular customer at the Wilson General Store. He always came alone, leaving his children at the hotel or later, once they had moved to the ranch, under the supervision of his oldest daughter, Emma. Margaret found herself looking forward to his visits, partly because he was always polite and straightforward in his business dealings, but also because she was genuinely curious about how he was managing his complicated situation. The story of his family's tragedy emerged gradually through casual conversation during these visits. His wife, Catherine, had died suddenly of pneumonia during the harsh Colorado winter, leaving him alone with 5 children ranging in age from 4 to 12. The ranch they had built together held too many painful memories, and Daniel had decided that a fresh start in new territory would be best for everyone. Catherine was the heart of our family, he told Margaret one afternoon as she helped him calculate the cost of materials needed to repair his barn. She had a way of making everything work, keeping all of us organized and happy. Without her, nothing felt right anymore. Margaret could hear the grief still present in his voice, even months after his loss. She had seen this kind of devastating sorrow before in other widowed customers, but Daniel's situation was complicated by the presence of so many children who needed his attention and care. It must be especially difficult with the children missing their mother, she said carefully, not wanting to intrude but hoping to offer some kind of support or understanding. They're grieving in their own ways, Daniel acknowledged. Emma tries to take care of the younger ones, but she's just a child herself. The boys are angry most of the time, and little Mary won't talk about her mother at all. Tommy, the youngest, keeps asking when Mama is coming home. Margaret felt her heart ache for this family trying to rebuild their lives while dealing with such profound loss. She had experience with grief, having lost her own mother when she was 16, but she could not imagine trying to help 5 children through such pain while managing her own sorrow. As the weeks passed, Margaret began to see the Cooper children around town more frequently. Emma would bring the younger ones to the store occasionally when their father was busy with ranch work, and Margaret was impressed by the girl's maturity and the gentle way she managed her siblings. The children were well-behaved but clearly struggling with their new circumstances. The community's response to the Cooper family was mixed. Some neighbors offered help with advice and occasional assistance, but others seemed to view Daniel's situation as proof that a man could not successfully raise children alone. Margaret overheard conversations at church and around town that were critical of his decision to take on ranch work while caring for 5 grieving children. It's not natural, she heard Mrs. Patterson tell Mrs. Jenkins one Sunday after church. Those children need a mother's care, and that man needs a wife to help him manage everything. He's going to run himself into the ground trying to do everything alone. Margaret found herself growing defensive about Daniel's efforts, though she was not entirely sure why. She had observed his careful attention to his children's needs and his determination to provide for them despite overwhelming challenges. If his methods were unconventional, they seemed to be motivated by genuine love and concern for his family's welfare. The criticism became more pointed when Daniel's 10-year-old son, Michael, was injured while helping with fence repairs. The boy had been trying to assist his father and had cut his hand badly on a piece of wire. Dr. Harrison, the same physician who had delivered Margaret's devastating news years earlier, treated the wound but made his disapproval clear. Children that age should be in school, not doing dangerous ranch work, he told several people around town. That boy could have lost fingers if the cut had been worse. Someone needs to talk sense into Cooper before one of those children is seriously hurt. Margaret knew that Daniel had been planning to enroll the children in Cedar Ridge's school once he got the ranch established, but the immediate demands of survival had taken precedence over formal education. She also knew that many ranch families routinely involve their children in age-appropriate work, and that Michael's injury was the kind of accident that could happen to any child in any family. When Daniel came to the store a few days after the accident to purchase medical supplies and bandages, Margaret could see the weight of community judgment in his shoulders. He looked exhausted and discouraged in a way that went beyond normal physical tiredness. "How is Michael doing?" she asked as she gathered the items he needed. "He's healing well," Daniel replied, but his voice carried a defensive edge that had not been there in previous conversations. "Dr. Harrison says there should be no permanent damage." Margaret could hear the unspoken criticism he had received, and she felt compelled to offer some kind of support or reassurance. "Accidents happen," she said simply. "I've seen plenty of children hurt themselves in supposedly safe situations. You can't protect them from everything." Daniel looked up at her with surprise, as if he had not expected understanding from anyone in the community. "People seem to think I'm not capable of caring for my own children," he said quietly. Margaret felt a flash of anger on his behalf, though she was careful to keep her voice neutral. "People always have opinions about how others should live their lives," she said. "What matters is that your children know they're loved and cared for. Anyone can see that when they watch you with them." This conversation marked a turning point in Margaret's relationship with Daniel Cooper. He began to linger in the store after completing his business, talking with her about his challenges and frustrations. Margaret found herself offering practical advice based on her observations of other families in the community and her knowledge of local resources. Mrs. Henderson used to run a small school in her kitchen for children who lived too far from town, she told him one afternoon. "Maybe Emma could teach the younger ones their letters and numbers while you're working. She's bright enough to handle basic instruction." Daniel's face lit up with relief at this suggestion. "I've been worried about their education," he admitted. "Catherine taught them at home in Colorado, but I don't have her knowledge or patience for that kind of teaching." Margaret found herself thinking about the Cooper family's challenges long after these conversations ended. She admired Daniel's determination to provide for his children despite overwhelming odds, and she was increasingly frustrated by the community's criticism of his efforts. She began to understand that his situation paralleled her own in some ways. He was judged inadequate for a role that society deemed essential, just as she was considered useless as a potential wife. The difference was that Daniel's perceived inadequacy stemmed from circumstances beyond his control, while hers was seen as an inherent flaw in her nature. This distinction seemed unfair to Margaret, who was beginning to see that both of them were being judged by narrow standards that did not account for their individual strengths and contributions. As summer progressed, Margaret found herself increasingly invested in the Cooper family's success. She began setting aside items that might be useful for children, offering them at reduced prices when Daniel's budget was tight. She started keeping small treats behind the counter for occasions when the children accompanied their father to the store. "You're very kind to my family," Daniel observed one evening in late July as Margaret helped his youngest son, Tommy, select a piece of penny candy. I want you to know that your friendship has meant a great deal to us during this difficult time." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, though she was careful not to read more into them than simple gratitude. "Everyone needs friends," she replied simply, "especially when they're facing challenges alone." What neither Margaret nor Daniel realized at that moment was how closely the townspeople were watching their growing friendship, and how this developing relationship would soon become the subject of intense speculation and judgment throughout Cedar Ridge. Margaret Wilson had heard the whispers her entire life. At 28, she remained unmarried in a small Montana town where most women wed by 20. The women at church shook their heads when they spoke of her, their voices carrying just loud enough for her to hear. "Poor Margaret," they would say, "sweet girl. But what man wants a wife who can't give him children?" The doctor in Billings had delivered the news when Margaret was 22. After months of painful episodes and irregular bleeding, Dr. Harrison had examined her with the gentle manner of a man who had delivered difficult news many times before. "I'm sorry, Miss Wilson," he had said, his voice soft but firm. "The scarring from the fever you had as a child has made it impossible for you to bear children. You'll need to find other ways to build a meaningful life." Margaret had walked home from that appointment in a daze, the Montana wind whipping her brown hair around her face. In 1887, a woman's worth was measured by her ability to produce sons to work the land and daughters to help with household duties. Without that possibility, she had become what the townspeople whispered she was, useless as a wife. Her father, Thomas Wilson, owned the general store in Cedar Ridge, a growing town that served the ranchers and farmers scattered across the valley. He was a kind man who had never made Margaret feel less valuable because of her condition, but she could see the worry in his eyes. At 55, he was getting older, and the store required more energy than he could give. Margaret had stepped in naturally, learning to manage inventory, handle the books, and deal with suppliers from as far away as Denver. "You have a head for business," her father often told her, pride evident in his voice. "Better than most men I know." But Margaret knew that praise, however genuine, could not change the fundamental reality of her situation. In a world where women were valued primarily as wives and mothers, her business skills were seen as interesting but ultimately irrelevant. The Wilson family had moved to Cedar Ridge when Margaret was 15, following the railroad as it pushed westward. Thomas had seen opportunity in the growing town, and his general store had prospered as more families settled in the valley. Margaret had watched the town grow from a collection of rough buildings to a proper community with a school, a church, and even a small hotel for travelers. She had made friends among the other young women, but, one by one, they had married and started families. Sarah Jenkins had wed the blacksmith and already had 3 children. Mary Patterson had married a rancher and moved 20 miles south to his spread. Even shy little Emma Cole had found a husband among the railroad workers and moved to the growing city of Helena. Margaret remained, helping her father with increasing responsibility while watching her contemporaries build the lives that seemed forever beyond her reach. She had received a few tentative proposals over the years, mostly from men who saw her father's successful business and thought a practical arrangement might suit them. But when they learned of her condition, the interest inevitably faded. "I don't understand why it matters so much," she had confided to her friend Ruth Morrison one afternoon as they worked together preparing quilts for the church's charity drive. "There's more to marriage than having children. There's companionship, partnership, building a life together." Ruth, who was pregnant with her 4th child, had looked at Margaret with sympathy, but also puzzlement. "Of course those things matter, Margaret. But a man needs sons to help with his work and daughters to care for him when he's old. It's just the way things are." Margaret understood the logic, but it did not make the isolation any easier to bear. She threw herself into her work at the store and into community activities, becoming known for her organizational skills and her willingness to help anyone in need. When the schoolteacher fell ill for 3 weeks, Margaret stepped in to teach the children. When the pastor's wife needed help organizing the church's annual harvest celebration, Margaret volunteered her time and energy. "That girl has the heart of a servant," Pastor Miller often said, and Margaret knew he meant it as the highest compliment. But she also knew that having the heart of a servant was not the same as having the opportunity to serve as a wife. and mother. The work at the general store had taught Margaret skills that few women in Cedar Ridge possessed. She could calculate complex orders in her head, negotiate with suppliers, and manage inventory with precision. She understood credit and bookkeeping, and she had developed relationships with wholesalers in 3 states. When her father traveled to Denver on buying trips, he increasingly left her in charge of the entire operation. "You run this place better than I do," he admitted one evening as they closed the store together. Margaret was reconciling the day's receipts while he swept the floors. "I sometimes wonder what will happen to all this knowledge you've accumulated." Margaret had wondered the same thing. Her father was in good health, but he was not getting younger. If something happened to him, she would inherit the store, but running it alone as an unmarried woman would present challenges. Customers might prefer to do business with a man, and suppliers might question her authority. The independence she had gained through her work could disappear quickly if circumstances changed. Despite these concerns, Margaret had found genuine satisfaction in the work. She enjoyed the variety of customers who came through the store, from rough cowboys buying supplies for month-long cattle drives to farm wives carefully selecting fabric for new dresses. She took pride in keeping the shelves well-stocked and in finding ways to obtain special items that customers requested. The store had become a gathering place for news and gossip, and Margaret found herself at the center of the community's information network. She knew who was struggling financially and might need extended credit. She knew which ranchers were expanding their herds and which farmers were considering selling their land. She knew about births and deaths, marriages and divorces, successes and failures throughout the valley. This knowledge had made her valuable in ways that went beyond her business skills. People trusted her judgment and often sought her advice on practical matters. Young wives asked her about managing household budgets. Ranchers consulted her about the best times to place large orders for supplies. Even some of the men in town had begun to respect her opinions on matters of business and community planning. But respect and admiration, Margaret had learned, were not the same as romantic interest. Men appreciated her intelligence and her skills, but they did not see her as a potential partner. She was useful, reliable, and trustworthy, but she was not the kind of woman who inspired the deeper feelings that led to marriage proposals. Margaret had made peace with this reality, or so she told herself. She had created a meaningful life within the constraints imposed by her circumstances. She contributed to her community, supported her father, and found satisfaction in work that challenged her abilities. If this was not the life she had once imagined for herself, it was still a life with purpose and value. The loneliness, however, remained a constant companion. Margaret lived with her father in the apartment above the store, and while their relationship was warm and supportive, she missed the intimate companionship that marriage might have provided. She missed having someone to share her thoughts with at the end of the day, someone to plan and dream with, someone to face life's challenges alongside. She had tried to fill this void through friendships, but most of the women her age were consumed by the demands of their families. Ruth Morrison remained a close friend, but their conversations were often interrupted by the needs of Ruth's children. The unmarried women in town were mostly much younger, and Margaret found little in common with girls who still believed that marriage and children were simply a matter of time. Books had become Margaret's refuge. She ordered novels and magazines through the store's suppliers, building a small library in her room above the shop. She read voraciously, traveling to distant places and times through the stories of other people's adventures and romances. These books provided escape, but also highlighted what was missing from her own life. Sunday evenings were the hardest. After church, families would gather for large dinners, children would play together in yards and fields, and couples would take walks along the river that ran through Cedar Ridge. Margaret would return to the empty store, help her father prepare for the coming week, and then retreat to her room with a book and a cup of tea. "You should travel," her father suggested one such evening. "You've saved money from your work here, and you're smart enough to handle yourself in big cities. Maybe you could visit your cousin in San Francisco, or even go back east to see some of the places you've read about." Margaret had considered this possibility, but she was reluctant to leave her father alone with the store for extended periods. More importantly, She was not sure that travel would solve her fundamental problem. She would still be an unmarried woman with no prospects for changing that situation, just in different locations. The spring of 1887 brought changes to Cedar Ridge that would alter the trajectory of Margaret's life, though she could not have predicted this at the time. The railroad company announced plans to extend the line further west, which would bring new opportunities but also new challenges to the town's established businesses. More significantly for Margaret's personal story, a new family arrived in the valley that would test everything she thought she knew about her own limitations and possibilities. James Morrison, Ruth's husband, stopped by the store one April morning with news that had the whole town talking. "There's a fellow named Cooper bought the old Henderson place," he reported as Margaret measured out 10 pounds of flour for his monthly order. "Paid cash, from what I hear, and he's got 5 children with him." Margaret looked up from her work with interest. New residents always meant potential new customers, and a family with 5 children would likely need significant supplies. "What's his story?" she asked, genuinely curious about anyone willing to take on the challenging task of working the Henderson ranch. "Widower, apparently," James continued, counting out coins from his leather pouch. "Wife died back in Colorado, and he decided to start fresh somewhere new. The children are young, from what folks are saying. Going to be quite a challenge for one man to manage a ranch and raise all those kids." Margaret nodded sympathetically while wrapping James's purchases. She had seen other widowed fathers struggle with the dual demands of earning a living and caring for children. The Henderson place was good land, but it had been abandoned for 2 years and would require significant work to become productive again. Adding the care of 5 children to that challenge seemed almost overwhelming. "I expect we'll see them in here before long," she told James as he prepared to leave. New arrivals always need supplies, and if he's planning to work that ranch seriously, he'll need everything from seed to tools. What Margaret could not have anticipated was how profoundly this new arrival would challenge everything the town believed about her value as a potential wife, and everything she believed about her own possibilities for happiness.